Hey, everybody. Glad to be here with you all tonight. We should be having yet another great late night conversation. Let's do it. Here we go.
Spoken of the American century. I say that the century on which we are entering can be and must be the century of the common man.
A radical redistribution of economic power.
I mean, we know that racism is just it's a byproduct of capitalism. Everything would be all right if everything was put back in the hands of the people.
We need a government that will make sure Americans are taken care of and organize the economy to serve the people, not the profits of a wealthy few.
We now have the techniques and the resources to get rid of poverty.
We got to start getting out there with the people.
Get out of the movement and get to the masses.
We need a government of action.
Welcome, everybody. I'm glad that you are here. We're going to, just like we always do, have another late night stream, but it is Good Friday for those of us observing the Catholic and Protestant calendar. It's not Good Friday in the Orthodox tradition, but it is Good Friday for those of us that are Protestant or Catholic. So I'll be talking about that. But before we get to that, do want to remind you all that we do generally have a format on these streams about how we do things. Generally, I give my opening remarks, which is whatever I want to talk about. Then from there, we do a roll call, and then I answer your questions for the remainder of the show. And so we're going to do that tonight. So if you have a question, you can send me a Rumble rant, or you can Cash App me. Send questions via Rumble rant or Cash App to Caleb Maupin 22. All right. So that is the way that you can send me questions for the second half of the program. That's the way we do things. So I do want to remind you all that coming up in July is going to be the biggest event the Center for Political Innovation has ever done by far. It's going to be our Chicago convention. That is on July 12th, and it will be the biggest event that we have ever done. And it's going to be really important. This event is going to change the conversation when it comes to imperialism and the new economy arising around the world, and the need to fight for working families and oppose the attacks on our civil liberties and all the issues that CPI, Center for Political Innovation, talks about. This is going to be a pretty definitive event. It'll be the anti-imperialist gathering of the year. And because of that, we need you there. It's going to be at the Midwest Conference Center. It's air conditioned, Kinkle. It's air conditioned. And it's going to be awesome. Scott Ritter is going to be there. Garland Nixon is going to be there. And we're talking to some other people. We got some pretty good leads on other big speakers. There's going to be musical performances. It's going to be a really, really awesome gathering. So if you oppose the danger of a new world war, if you oppose, working families grinding into poverty and our freedoms being taken away, and if you want to get together with another group of people that stand for all of the things that we talk about on these streams, if you want to be around 400 other like-minded anti-imperialist people, this is the event to go to. And if there's one event that you get to this year, I would make it this event. This is where you need to be. So mark your calendar. July is a pretty far away. Get some time off work, book your bus, plane, flight, train, automobile, bicycle, just get there somehow. You don't want to miss it. It's going to be absolutely awesome. It's going to be great. So we will see you there in Chicago. And as I said before, the way we do things tonight is just like we always do things, which is opening remarks followed by the roll call. And then I answer questions for the remainder of the show. And the way questions are taken is Rumble rants on the Rumble, or you can Cash App me at Caleb Maupin 22. That is the way we do it. So yeah, let's talk about stuff. First things first, last night's stream was pretty wild. A guy came on, said he wanted to debate me about China. So I brought him on, and I did not know that the guy who came on the stream was actually a famous YouTuber. He's got over 300,000 subscribers on his YouTube channel. And he is a guy who is apparently a very famous fitness YouTuber called Vegan Gains. And if I had known he was that famous, I probably would have kept him on for longer than 11 minutes. But we had an 11-minute debate about China. The guy is very mistaken on a lot of points, but it was certainly surprising. And I'm still trying to process why that guy came on the stream. I feel like that couldn't have been random, right? I've got 36,000 followers. He's got 308,000. And he came on, just randomly came on my stream to talk to me about China. It was very interesting, but hey, who knows? These things happen. Yeah, it was a strange interaction, I must say. And I posted it as a standalone video. And so it's here on the channel. And hey, we are in a weird time of possibilities where all kinds of things are happening. Our economy is doing weird things right now because of the tariffs, because of Tesla, because of all kinds of stuff. There's negotiations going on in Ukraine, but there's talk that the negotiations may end. There's talk that negotiations may increase. There's negotiations going on in Oman between the United States and Iran. And there's talk that could end or that could increase and go certain ways. There's all kinds of things happening right now. And a lot of people are very afraid because they're afraid of what the economy could mean. They're afraid of war breaking out. They're afraid of, there's a lot of just confusion and insecurity at this time. But you're not all here to get me to just talk about insecurity and fear. And it is Good Friday, which is a very, very important day for those of us that are Christians. So I figured we should just start out by asking the question, who was Jesus? Who was Jesus Christ? That's a fair question to ask. There are some people who maintain that he did not exist, right? Those people who maintain that Jesus Christ did not exist are what's called mythicists. And mythicists are those that maintain Jesus Christ was not a historical figure at all. They're not simply atheists. They say that the figure who's featured in the Christian Gospels is not based on a real person, that it is simply a fabrication. And that's what mythicists believe. But among historians, even, atheistic historians, even very anti-religious or anti-Christian historians, the mythicist view is a very significant minority. It is pretty overwhelmingly understood among historians that some historical Jesus Christ did exist. Now, one book that I've drawn heavily from is called The Foundations of Christianity by Karl Kautsky. Karl Kautsky is not totally a mythicist. He's close to a mythicist. He maintains that Jesus Christ is a composite figure. He argues that there were a number of messianic figures who fought against the Roman Empire among Jews in Palestine, and that Jesus Christ is a composite of a variety of different figures that led uprisings against the Romans. That the story of Jesus is a cobbling together of various anti-Roman revolutionaries who fought the Romans, etc. And that's very similar to what is argued by Elaine Pagels. Elaine Pagels, I remember when I was in college, she was touring. She's an Ivy League professor who is known for writing on theological matters, biblical history. And she toured, and she was talking about the historicity of the Christian Gospels. And she also argued that Jesus was some kind of revolutionary figure because he was crucified. And I remember sitting in the auditorium at Baldwin Wallace College, which is now called Baldwin Wallace University, and hearing Elaine Pagels explain that crucifixion was reserved only for those who had actively fought against the Roman state, right? That the Romans killed all kinds of people. They beheaded them. They hung them. They killed all kinds of people in many different ways. But to be crucified generally meant that you had done something that was considered to be subversion. You were an enemy of the Roman Empire. You had worked to violently oppose the Roman Empire. You were an insurrectionist. And that actually points to the nature of crucifixion. That crucifixion is, is your body is on display. The point of crucifixion, it's a very painful death, but it's a very public death, right? It's people watch you, right? You're kind of nailed up publicly and everyone sees you dying. They're making an example out of you, so to speak. And that form of capital punishment, the death penalty, was reserved only for those who'd engaged in insurrection against the Roman Empire, she argues. But Elaine Pagels goes a little bit further. And Elaine Pagels maintains that there was no complicity in the execution of Jesus Christ by the Romans because Jewish law does not permit crucifixion. She argues that according to Jewish teachings, it is illegal to shout, "Crucify him," because of the fact that the Jewish teachings say the only way you can execute somebody is by stoning them to death. And so she maintains that the fact that Pontius Pilate wanted to release Jesus Christ, the fact that the crowds gathered and said, "Give us Barabbas, crucify him," she maintains that that is a fabrication and that was invented so that the Christian church could become legalized in Rome, that you couldn't have a religion based on someone who was an enemy of the Roman Empire, which Jesus clearly was because he was crucified. So they invented a loophole in the story where the Roman leader, Pontius Pilate, did not actually want to kill Jesus Christ. It was actually his own people, the Jews, who wanted to kill him. And Pontius Pilate tried not to, but the mob of angry Jewish folks just said, "No, crucify him. And that is the reason that Jesus was crucified. So therefore, the Romans would be less uncomfortable with a religion that centered around Jesus Christ, because the Romans really didn't want to kill him. He wasn't really an enemy of the Roman state. Now, there's a couple problems with that story. a couple problems, which is that at the time, not all Jews living in Palestine had the same religious beliefs. The Pharisees were the primary sect, but there were also Essenes, and there were other practitioners that had different interpretations of how the Jewish law was applied. Furthermore, it was not in violation of Hebrew law for the Romans to crucify Jesus. Now, this is where it gets very interesting. Yes, the Jewish leaders could not crucify Jesus. That was a sin. The only form of execution allowed by the Torah and by the Jewish religion as it was practiced at that time among the various sects was stoning. However, the Romans were not Jews. And for them to ask a non-Jew to do something that a non-Jew was allowed to do, that in and of itself is not considered to be a sin. For example, I've heard the story many times of, Orthodox Jews. They cannot turn a light switch on the Sabbath. That's a sin. However, Orthodox Jews, when they really need the lights to be turned on the Sabbath, they will go and find a non-Jew and point to the light switch and have him do it. And that's not considered to be a sin. Not considered to be a sin. And having a non-Jew do something that Jews are not allowed to do is not considered a sin in the Jewish law. I mean, so for the Jews to ask the Romans to crucify Jesus, that's not a violation of that's kind of like asking a Gentile to turn the light switch for you on the Sabbath. It's permitted. So Elaine Pagel's argument that the Jews couldn't have said that isn't exactly correct. However, she does point to the reality that Jesus Christ was crucified, which was something that was only reserved for enemies of the Roman state. That's true. It was the most extreme form of death penalty that existed back then. And that points to some other interesting realities. Now, I'll just point this out since we're on the topic, right? Have you ever seen the movie Spartacus? It's one of my favorite movies. The movie Spartacus, it's a movie that came out in the early 1960s, and it's based on a short story by a Marxist, or not a short story, a novel by the Marxist Howard Fast. And in the early 60s, they made this movie called Spartacus. And it was about the slave uprising that happened in the year 73 BC. In the year 73 BC, a lot of slaves in Rome rose up against the Roman Empire, led by a gladiator named Spartacus. And this gladiator led a slave uprising, and the Roman army fought against the slaves, and eventually the slaves lost. And they crucified all the slaves who had participated in the uprising. And like the road between wherever the battle was and Rome, all the way back, they crucified various people along the road. And they depict this in the movie, but I'll show you. This is a still from the movie. Let me just pull it up here. This is a still from the movie Spartacus. And this is towards the end of the movie where they show the crucifixion. You'll notice that the various slaves that are crucified are not crucified on crosses, right? They're crucified on T's. And why was that? That was because the Catholic Legion of Decency was very, very upset about this movie. existing at all because it had been written by a Communist Party member named Howard Fast, because the screenplay was written by a blacklisted Communist Party member named Dalton Trumbo. And the Catholic Legion of Decency very strongly objected to the film. And they considered showing other people nailed to crosses to somehow be offensive or undermining of Christianity. So as a concession to the Catholic Legion of Decency, I think it was, what is it, MGM or Universal Studios or whichever film company made the film, they set it up so at the end of the film, when all these slave revolutionaries are being crucified, they're crucified on T's rather than on crosses, which is very interesting. But this points to what Elaine Pagels talks about also, which is that crucifixion was reserved for those who engaged in an uprising against the Roman Empire. And that's what these slaves did. And it is a historical fact that the slaves were all crucified. Now, what's also interesting, and this raises some interesting things, Jehovah's Witnesses. I don't know if you've ever had the Jehovah's Witnesses knock on your door. Jehovah's Witnesses, they don't use crosses in any of their rituals. And the reason that they don't use crosses is because of the fact that they maintain that Jesus was not crucified on a cross. It was a stick, and that his hands were above his head, and they crucified him on a stick. And that the cross is actually an astrological symbol that relates to the spring equinox and where the stars align during the traditional celebration of Easter. And they maintain the cross as a pagan astrological symbol, and that Jesus was actually killed on a stick. Right. And I guess the word in Greek for what Jesus was nailed to is wood. Right. I guess that is my understanding, that the Gospels say he was nailed to wood. Right. It doesn't say cross. Right. And that the cross becoming the symbol of Christianity. And this is where it gets all interesting. Right. There's the one of the founding fathers of the United States, Thomas Paine, argued that the Christian Gospels were largely astrological symbolism, right? That Jesus rising on the third day was an analogy for the sun, the sun rising near the cross, what do you call that? The constellation of the cross in the sky. And this is, people look at all of these things, right? And that, it's not a coincidence that December 25th is around the time of the winter solstice. It's not a coincidence that Easter is around the time of the Passover and the spring equinox. But the Passover also, right? That's the Jewish holiday that, Easter is lined up with. Right, and it's supposed to be during Passover that Jesus was crucified, according to the Gospels. So it makes sense, right? And that part of the reason, the other thing is that according to the Christian Gospels, Jesus didn't completely die from crucifixion. According to the Christian Gospels, he was crucified. And it takes quite a long time to die from crucifixion because, they're not killing you. They just nailed you to a cross and you just stay there. Right. And you're dehydrated. You don't eat, you don't drink, and you're just nailed up there. And that you eventually die from exhaustion. This is what many people have pointed out. It's kind of interesting. The actual way that one dies when being crucified is from exhaustion. You wouldn't think that now, would you? But I guess when you're nailed to a cross, right, you have to lift yourself up to breathe. Okay. So your arms are nailed, your feet are nailed. And so in order to breathe, your body has to lift itself in order to breathe. You're held down by your feet and by your arms. And so you're lifting a little bit every time you breathe. And I guess the way you die from crucifixion is that you eventually just get so exhausted you can't lift yourself up to breathe anymore, and you die. And it takes quite a long time. And apparently, because Passover was happening, and that was a Jewish holiday, and having dead bodies on display during having someone crucified and dying on display during the Passover was considered to be a very offensive thing. And so to get the whole process over with, they took a spear and they stabbed him, between the ribs and just finished him off. And they just finished him off, and that was that. And that is generally what is understood. Now, this all gets interesting, right? This all gets very, very interesting, because the crucifixion of Jesus Christ, ends up being the central story of European civilization. Right? Jesus Christ exists in Palestine, according to, other than the mythicists, everyone agrees there was a historical figure and that he existed in Palestine at the time of Roman occupation. And the story goes that he was crucified, that he rose again from the dead, and his followers proliferated, and that almost immediately the religion spread to the capital of the known world, which was Rome. And Rome was the center of the world empire, right? It was the city-state on the Italian peninsula that was the ruler of the known world, the Roman Empire. That Rome proliferated to Rome, that Christianity proliferated in Rome, and in Rome, it became popular. It was heavily suppressed, but it continued to exist. It was heavily suppressed. And after a couple generations, it was so widespread in Rome that the Roman Emperor Constantine converted to Christianity. And after the Roman Emperor Constantine converted to Christianity, at that point it was completely legal, and it became almost the official religion of the Roman Empire. However, after Constantine died, the next emperor was it Justin the Apostate, or the next Roman emperor was not a Christian, and then after that, Rome was Christian, and that Rome was deteriorating for the entire time that it was Christianizing. And that's one thing that was a point of defensiveness on the part of Christianity as an early religion, because the Roman Empire was this mighty empire that had ruled the entire modern world. However, almost simultaneously with the Roman Empire becoming Christian, it starts deteriorating and falls apart. And that's not a really good selling point, because this is the time when, prior to the Christianization of Europe, generally people worshipped gods who they believed would give them strength and give them power, right? The Germans worshipped Odin, the god of grit and valor. The various city-states had their defender gods, etc. So if you're convincing people to start worshiping Jesus, and then they look at Rome and say, geez, Rome, they started worshiping Jesus, and then they fell apart, it's not a really good selling point. And apparently that is one of the main points of defensiveness that is made in the work of St. Augustine in his book, The City of God. And he's explaining that Christianity is just not intended to hold your empire together, that it doesn't serve that purpose. The City of God is an important theological text of the early Christian church. It has quite a few different like parables and interpretations of the Bible in it that became key in establishing the beliefs of the Roman Catholic Church, and that is a big point of importance, is that, he's defensively pointing out that the Roman Empire fell roughly at the same time it was becoming Christianized. But then that interestingly leads us to what is said by Karl Kautsky. And I really do draw a lot from what Karl Kautsky wrote. Karl Kautsky wrote a book called The Foundations of Christianity. And I think the book makes some very interesting and strong arguments. I would recommend reading the book. I learned a lot from it. It gives kind of an economic interpretation of Christianity. But the context is important also. So Karl Kautsky was a German Marxist, and he was the leader of the Social Democratic Party of Germany. And at the time, late 1890s, early 1900s, Marxism was becoming very, very popular in Europe, and especially in Germany. The Social Democratic Party of Germany was the flagship Marxist party. And Karl Kautsky was the main writer and intellectual associated with German social democracy. And Germany is a very Christian country. At the time, it was heavily divided between Protestants and Catholics. But Germany was a new country, and it was, you had a lot of Catholics and you had a lot of Lutheran Protestants. And so Karl Kautsky wrote a book giving an explanation of Christianity from his Marxist materialist perspective. And that book was called The Foundations of Christianity. And it makes some interesting points. And what it argues is that the reason that Christianity proliferated is because Christianity began to express the interests of the Roman proletariat. And that is very interesting. So the idea is, ancient Rome that's slavery, right? It's a mode of production called slavery. You have hunter-gatherer civilization. Out of hunter-gatherer civilization, you get ancient Egypt, and you get ancient Greece, and you get ancient Rome, and these are slave civilizations. And in slave civilizations, you have landowners who own land, and they also own people who work the land. And there are two classes, those who own and those who get owned. You have slaves who are owned by other people, and you have landowners who own land and own people. And that is generally how in the ancient world societies existed. Eventually, you had the rise of feudalism, which is a different system. But in the slave system, some people own slaves and some people are slaves. And I mean, there's a lot of things like this. For example, the word family, right? That's a Latin word, familia, that referred to all of the property of a man, right? You had a free man, a Roman citizen, and then his familia referred to his land and his wife and his kids and his slaves and his animals, and everything that he owned was his familia. And so a man had a familia, right? A property owning man had a familia, and that included his wife and his kids and his land and his animals and his jewelry and his money, and everything that he owned was his familia. And that's where the word family actually comes from. It's kind of interesting to think about. And that the way ancient Rome was set up was that you had citizens, Roman citizens, and to be a Roman citizen, I believe you had to own property to be a Roman citizen. And you had, the old, like the original landowners and new people who moved in, patricians and plebeians. But they were basically the same class. They were landowners, people who owned land. And the way it worked was they had a bunch of slaves who worked on the land. And that was that. And increasingly, though, in Rome, there became a layer of people who moved into Rome that were neither slaves nor slave owners. And they were craftsmen, usually. They had some kind of skill that a slave did not have. They were bricklayers. They were blacksmiths and metal workers. They were carpenters. They were doctors. There were people who moved into Rome, which was the capital of the modern world, who didn't own any land, but nobody owned them. They were neither slaves nor masters. And the word that was used in Latin to describe them was proletarius. And the word proletarius literally means one who has children. Now, that's kind of interesting. That's literally what the word for this class of people in ancient Rome literally means. It means one who has children. Why? Because they didn't have any property. The only thing they owned was their offspring. The proletarians only owned their offspring, and so they were proletariat. They were those who have children, the childbearing class, as Nico says it. Or they were the men of no property. Nobody owned them, but they did not own anyone else or any land or anything except their offspring. That's really all they had. And they rented themselves out to their employer. They received wages for their pipe fitting or their bricklaying or their metalworking or their carpentry. They got wages from their employer. And Rome increasingly imported a number of proletarians, skilled workers who came to Rome to make money, to live. But they had a problem, which is that they didn't own any land. So if they couldn't find any work, they couldn't live. They had to rent where they lived because they didn't have any land. They didn't have any place to live. And if they couldn't find work, they became unemployed and they became hungry. And that's why Rome is the first society in history to have what's called homelessness. Slaves are never homeless. They're somebody else's property, and they live with that somebody else. Slaves are never homeless. But proletarians can be homeless because if they're not working, they cannot pay their rent to the place in which they live, and so they're out on the street. And ancient Rome, that was one thing that shocked many of the great kings and leaders from around the world who visited Rome, which was the richest city in the world, the capital of the modern world, as they saw all these hungry, poor children begging on the street. And they saw very, very old people hunched over begging for money. And they said, what is going on here? Well, these people, these children that were begging on the street were the children of proletarians. And these old folks who were hunched over, who were begging for money on the street, they were elderly proletarians. And if you could not pay your rent, if you could not make enough wages to pay your rent, you became homeless. And that's not something that happened to slaves. It wasn't something that happened to slave owners. It was something that happened to proletarians. And that the proletariat, as this new class, this class of wage workers, existed in Rome. And that one aspect of pre-Christian Rome that I think is very interesting, very, very, very interesting, that really speaks to, because I would argue we do the same thing now in our civilization, not on the same scale, but in ancient Rome, religion was, first of all, it was polytheistic, meaning they believed in many different gods, right? Jupiter was the head god. He was like their version of Zeus. But there was the god of the ocean, Neptune. And there was Mars, the god of war, right? That was their version of Ares. Neptune was their version of the Greek Poseidon. And they had taken the Greek religion and they kind of copied it. However, there was something about how they practiced it that was very interesting. Was that, Neptune was the god of the ocean, and that there was a special temple to Neptune that all of the sailors went to, and they prayed to Neptune, and they had special prayers they said to Neptune, and they had special ceremonies they engaged in to Neptune. And there were certain teachings that only sailors learned about Neptune, about the legends of Neptune, about the life of Neptune, etc. And you learned more the longer you were a sailor, right? If you were a sailor for 1 year, they taught you some of the story of Neptune. And then if you're a sailor another year, they taught you more of the story. It's kind of like Masonry, right? It's kind of like Freemasonry. But basically, the longer that you were a sailor, the more you learned about Neptune, the more rituals you got to participate in. And that these were the mystery religions of ancient Rome. And the same went for, Mars, the god of war. If you were in the army, you and all the other soldiers went to a special temple and you prayed to Mars, the god of war. And the longer that you were in the army and the higher up you got in the ranks, they taught you more of the legend of Mars and Mars's special teachings. And you got to participate in more rituals. And they call them the ancient Roman mysteries, the ancient Roman mystery religions, the ancient Roman mystery cults. But basically the way it worked was that every profession, every job had a god, a deity, who was the god of that profession. And that deity, you learned more the longer you were in that profession. And as you moved up the ranks of the sailors or the soldiers or whatever, you learned more of the legend and you participated in more exclusive rituals. And there was kind of a hierarchy among sailors, among soldiers, among basket weavers, among women. There were special goddesses for women only, and that you learned more of the story as you went. And that it was through gathering. The way sailors advocated for themselves was they gathered together at the Temple of Neptune. And not only did they engage in rituals, and not only did they tell certain stories and legends that were only for other sailors, but they also talked about their needs. And it was through their gatherings that they would, pressure the emperor and say, we need more ships to be built, or we need this. It was their place to gather and talk about being sailors. Same for the soldiers, right? They would gather at the Temple of Mars and they would talk about what it means to be a soldier and what kind of equipment and it was through their gathering that they talked about it. So what's interesting is that Christianity emerged in Rome following the pattern of the Roman mystery religions. This is very interesting. But as the proletarians, right, as these craftsmen, pipe fitters, bricklayers, carpenters, blacksmiths, as they're moving to Rome, they have to have their own religion. And almost all of them are either Jews from Palestine or Greeks from one of the Greek city-states. That's who they are. They're Greeks and Jews. And the Jews practice the Jewish monotheistic religion. The Greeks have a variety of religious traditions that they practice. And they group together. And among the proletarians of Rome, you have the first guilds, right? You know about the guilds, right? The associations, right, of skilled craftsmen, right? Before there were labor unions, back in medieval times in Europe, you had guilds, and it was through the guild you learned to be a blacksmith, and you had an apprenticeship in your guild where a senior blacksmith would teach you how to be a blacksmith, and after a while there was some ceremony where you officially got to be a blacksmith, right? And they had guilds, and they had guilds for pipe fitters, guilds for bricklayers, guilds for blacksmiths, guilds for carpenters. They had guilds. And the guilds were how they taught their craft to people. And the guilds also functioned as unions because they would agree, we won't work for a certain wage. If you don't pay a certain wage, we don't work, right? And they would decide, the going rate, if they're going to pay us 3 pieces of silver for a day's work, and all of them in the guild would agree, we are not going to work for 2 pieces of silver. And if somebody works for 2 pieces of silver, then the guild brothers took care of him because he was a scab, right? And this was the very beginning of the labor movement among the Roman proletarians, as you had these guilds of skilled craftsmen who came together and taught each other the craft. And they also, agreed to make demands on employers. They went on strike. It was the beginning of the labor movement among the proletarians. And the proletarians were largely Jews and Greeks. And it appears that at some point in ancient Rome, the Roman proletarians, many of whom were Jews from Palestine, but many more of whom were Greeks, began worshiping a carpenter named Jesus Christ, who had led an uprising against the Roman Empire. And that the way Christianity emerged is it was the mystery religion for proletarians. This is very interesting. It was the religion, the association for proletarians. It was part of the guild. It was part of the religious practice, right? They had to have their own rituals and ceremonies, and that as the Roman proletariat grew and proliferated, and more Greeks and Jews moved to Rome, and they didn't own any property, and they formed guilds to teach each other their crafts, and they had myths and legends and all of that, it appears that Christianity became the mystery religion or the mystery cult of the Roman proletarians. Now, this is very interesting. This is very, very interesting to me. And that's what Karl Kautsky argues in his book, is that Christianity took on that form. And that's how it originally existed, and that's why it was so heavily suppressed by the Roman Empire, because it was advocating on behalf of the proletarians against the landowning class, right? It was a guild. It was an association. It was a union. It was basically a labor union in the form of a religion among proletarians, asserting their economic rights against patricians and plebeians. That's what he argues. And then, furthermore, he argues that Christianity began to divide because there were things that the Christians did that benefited Roman society overall. Even though the Christians worshipped a guy the Roman Empire had killed, even though they said there was only one God and they denied all the gods of the empire, even though the Christians, in essence, were opposed to the Roman society, they did things that helped, because the Christians of Rome built the first orphanages. And that is true. There had never been orphanages. They had this big problem in Rome of all these homeless children. And Jesus, the carpenter, the founder of their religion, had said that you should care for those in need. And what you've done to the least of these, you've done unto me. And you were, and I was hungry and you fed me, and etc. I was in prison and you visited me, and I was naked and you clothed me, right? And so the Christians believed it was their obligation to help those in need. And so the Christians formed orphanages to care for the homeless children. And that was a social service that needed to be done. Rome was a lot safer when those Christians started building those orphanages, because those homeless, hungry kids would rob you. They would steal from you. They were pickpockets. But if they were in an orphanage, they were not out robbing people on the street. They were taken care of. And that the Christians, even though they believed something that was at odds with what the Roman Empire stood for, the things that they did helped. And it's interesting. It's very, very, very interesting to me. And that they did things that benefited Roman society overall. And that what Karl Kautsky argues is that Christianity divided and it gradually became watered down as the Romans kind of co-opted it and adopted a watered down version of it to try and hold their empire together, right? That are, the Roman society had been polytheistic, and there were many different gods, and a lot of these regions where different religious groups existed and different tribes and nationalities existed, they would rally around their local god in order to battle the Romans. And so the Romans, when they adopted Christianity that says there is only one God, by doing that, they could then outlaw all the other gods and say, if you're under Rome, you can only recognize one God. And that was a way to suppress the religious movements that might emerge that were in opposition to them. And that they took aspects of Jesus's teaching and used them to justify submission to earthly authority, right? Render unto Caesar what belongs to Caesar, right? And if you read in particular the letters that Paul wrote to the Romans, there's a lot of emphasis on obeying earthly authority. Because they were trying to become a legal religion. They were trying to not be wiped out. And if you read, I would argue that the epistles of the New Testament are very, very important to read, because the epistles of the New Testament are written by the Apostle Paul, who is going around trying to build a mass movement. He is trying to build a mass religious movement in various city-states, right? It's the Romans, the Corinthians, Ephesians, right? And that there's various city-states, big cities, right? The ancient world is a bunch of different cities, right? It's held together by a bunch of cities. And these cities are where people are gathering. And it was in those cities that Christianity was taking off as a religion. And Paul is the guy trying to hold the religion together and trying to keep it in check. And he's going from city to city, trying to organize a religion, trying to build a movement that's illegal, that is violently suppressed, etc. And he's trying to keep them from fighting with each other. And he's trying to keep them from becoming rivals of each other, and keep people from reinventing it for themselves. And so he's writing these letters, the epistles. That's the second half of the New Testament. He's writing these epistles that are basically, he's writing to the Ephesians, he's writing to the Corinthians, he's writing to the Romans. He's saying, we're trying to keep our religion together. And he's telling each particular area, he's giving instructions to them about how to be good Christians. It's very interesting. And some of the epistles are quite short. And some of them are quite long. And then the end of the New Testament, right? So let's just go over this, right? The New Testament of the Bible. You've got Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Those are the Gospels. Those are accounts of Jesus's life. Then after that, you have the book of Acts, which is about the founding of the church. It's about after the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Jesus assembles the disciples. He appears before the disciples, and he gives them the Great Commission. Go and make disciples of all nations. And the church is founded despite facing heavy persecution. And almost, I believe, every single one of the disciples is killed, executed, crucified. But it's the founding of the church. And the Apostle Paul emerges in the book of Acts as the guy who ends up being the guy who spreads the church everywhere. His original name is Saul. He's Saul of Tarsus. And he's a Jew whose job it is to go around persecuting the Christians. And he's traveling around the Middle East, persecuting Christians. And one day, the Apostle Paul is on the road to Damascus. He's visiting Syria. And he's on the road to Damascus, the capital of Syria. And he's riding his horse. And he falls off his horse. A bright light appears. He falls off his horse, and he has a vision of Jesus. And Jesus appears to him and says, "Why are you persecuting me?" And he's deeply moved by this experience. And when he gets to Damascus, instead of arresting the Christians and persecuting the local Christians, he joins them. And Saul of Tarsus changes his name to Paul to show his religious conversion. And he becomes the guy who starts taking Christianity, becomes the central organizer of Christianity. And he becomes the guy who organizes the Christian religion. And that's the book of Acts. And then you have the epistles, and it's all of Paul's writing, all the documents he's writing to all the churches and all the city-states as he's running around from different city-state to different city-state trying to organize the religion. And then the last book of the Bible is this very, very, very mysterious text called the Revelation to John. Right? Now, Hollywood has had a field day with it, and evangelicals have a particular interpretation of that text. Evangelicals very much view that text as being a prediction of the end times. And it's not clear who wrote it. There are many Christians who believe it was Apostle John the Apostle, who wrote it. But it's not clear. Somebody named John wrote it. And this somebody named John, whether it was John the Apostle or a separate John, not clear, right? And there's a lot of debate. And some Christian denominations maintain it was John, the follower of Jesus, the Apostle. And some maintain it was another guy named John. But somebody named John went to an island, a Greek island called Patmos. And on the island of Patmos, he had a spiritual vision, and he wrote it down. And the spiritual vision that he wrote down is called the Revelation to John. And it was important enough that when the Council of Nicaea decided to convene the books of the Bible, they thought this was such an important Christian text that it was right there with all of Paul's apostles. At the very end of the Bible, you've got the Revelation to John. And the Revelation to John is very esoteric. It's very, very esoteric. A lot of, there's the great beasts, right? And there's the four horsemen, and there's the whore of Babylon, and there's all kinds of stuff in it. And I must say, and I will say this, we look at the book of Revelation now, and we don't know what this means, right? He's seeing this, he's seeing that. But I can almost guarantee you that when the book of Revelation was first published, right, when it was first circulated, back then there was no printing press, so every copy was handwritten by somebody. I have an image in my head of the book of Revelation when it was first being circulated. If some scribe is in a church, an underground secret church in Ephesus, or in Corinth, or in wherever in Rome, and he's reading it out loud, and there's a room full of people, and they're going, oh, ooh, and they're reacting. They know exactly what it means. There's a room full of people like, no, oh, ooh, and they're all shocked because they know exactly what he's talking about. And I can almost guarantee you that that's the case, right? To us, in our time, it sounds kooky. It's the whore of Babylon and the emperor of the world and the four thises and the five that's and we doesn't make any sense to us. But back then, everybody knew what it was about, or else it wouldn't have been included. It wouldn't have been considered such an important text. The book of Revelation, the Revelation to John, is a wildly important text. And it made a lot of sense to the people the Christians at the time, and it hit home, and it was considered to be so important that they made it part of the Bible. Now, I will say that if you read the Revelation to John, what comes across is that is an angry polemic. That is some Christian on Christian violence. That's what that is. The revelation to John is a rant against sellout Christians. And a lot of the book of Revelations is saying that there are certain Christians at the time that are watering down the faith, that are accommodating with the Roman Empire, and they are going to go to hell, and they are rotten traitors. That's basically what the book of Revelations is. It is, there were sections of the Christian church that were accommodating to the Roman Empire, and John, whoever he was, had this vision that was largely an angry condemnation of those sellout Christians who drank of the iniquity of the whore of Babylon, right? Who there's the quote, there's the part that anti-Semites frequently quote about those who say they are Jews, but are not Jews, but are of the synagogue of Satan, right? And it's not ranting against Jews, right? It's actually saying that to be a Jew is a good thing. It's ranting against the Jews, those who say they are Jews, but are not Jews, and are instead the synagogue of Satan, right? That's what it's saying, right? It's ranting against people who speak in the name of the faith, but in reality are serving the devil, right? That's what it's ranting against, right? And there's a lot in there about how only those who remain true and refuse to back down, only they will enter the kingdom of heaven. There's a lot of statements about the people who sell out and the people who betray. They're going to suffer, but those of us who remain true, we are going to stay. I'll read you a couple of passages here, right? Right? He that overcometh shall inherit all things, and I will be his God, and he shall be my son. But the fearful and unbelieving and the abominable and murderers and whoremongers and sorcerers and idolaters and all liars shall have their part in the lake that burneth with fire and brimstone, which is the second death. Right? This is Revelation chapter 21. He said, I'll read it one more time. And he said unto me, it is done. I am the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end. And I will give unto him that is thirst the fountain of the water of life freely. But he that overcometh shall inherit all things, and I will be his God, and he shall be my son. But the fearful and unbelieving, the abominable and murderers and whoremongers and sorcerers and idolaters and all liars shall have their part in the lake which burneth with fire and brimstone, which is the second death. That's pretty intense. That's pretty intense stuff. Right? Those who overcome, those who endure till the end, who sacrifice, you're good. But all the people that that don't, you're screwed. It's very much, it's about, this whore of Babylon appears, and the whore of Babylon exists, and there are people that drink of her iniquity, that engage with the whore of Babylon somehow, and the whore of Babylon, she is evil, and those who go along with her are going to suffer. And it's interesting. I mean, people talk about buying and selling, and the Roman Empire, and the way that they wanted to be the middleman in all trade. And at the end of the day, we don't really know what it's about. But you can be sure that the ancient Roman Christians knew exactly what it was about. And you can pick up on the anger and the rage not against non-believers, but against sellouts, right? Against people who accommodate with the authorities that exist, people who went along with the persecution of the church, people who who accommodated. That is a really, really big theme in the book of Revelations. It's interesting. I didn't quite know where I was going to go with this tonight. It is Good Friday, and I am a Christian. And so, I'm talking about this from different angles based on different research that I've done over the years, telling you what I take from this. But I'll just be real with you for a moment. There was a Jesus Christ. He was the Son of God. He was crucified, and he did rise again on the third day. And the movement that he built that said the last shall be first, and the first shall be last, that movement is really the lifeblood of everything that is good in this world. It gives expression to the forces of good in this world. And you know who knows that? The forces of evil. They know it very, very well. The forces of evil know that Christianity is their enemy. And the forces of evil, they see Christianity and they don't like it. They don't like it, and they know it's what they're against. Friedrich Nietzsche. I've not even talked about Friedrich Nietzsche. Friedrich Nietzsche, German philosopher. Friedrich Nietzsche, right? There's a great book that takes apart the philosophy of Friedrich Nietzsche. It's called, I think I have it around here, it's called The Destruction of Reason by George Lukács. And one thing that George Lukács points out about Friedrich Nietzsche is that Friedrich Nietzsche was an atheist, was an anti-Christian, and an anti-communist, and that he thought the two were the same thing, and said that over and over and over again. And he taunted Marx and Marxists, and he said, this is nothing but Christianity. And he said, this is just a new version of Christianity. And he called it the doctrine of the lowly. And he said, the doctrine of the lowly makes for lowliness. And that he considered socialism and communism to be nothing but Christianity expressed as a political movement. Now, this is shocking, right? Because generally, communism and Christianity are considered to be opposites, right? Communism is the atheistic philosophy of Karl Marx that wanted to destroy the existing power structure, and European civilization that Marx was trying to overthrow, and the French Revolution was defined by Christianity, so they're considered opposites. But Friedrich Nietzsche emerges in the late 1800s as a German philosopher who celebrates Europe becoming less Christian. He actually thinks it's great that Europe is becoming less Christian, and he thinks that colonialism is helping Europe to de-Christianize. And he has this concept that he talks about called the blonde beast. And he argues that through colonialism, all the weak, love your neighbor, be nice to people stuff in European civilization is being gotten rid of. And that by being a colonizer, the European is becoming an Ubermensch. He's becoming a big, strong man because he's stripping away. He's losing his slave morality. Nietzsche considers Christianity and Judaism to be slave religion, a religion for the weakling. And he looks at ancient Greek religion, and he looks at the religion of the Roman Empire and says, that's the religion that we need. We need religion that encourages people to be strong, religion that's not for the weakling, etc. And he thinks that colonialism is great because it's leading to Europe becoming less and less Christian, because as Europe is becoming less and less Christian, then they're getting back to their big, strong, this is Friedrich Nietzsche. Nietzsche says God is dead, right? And he wrote the book, Thus Spake Zarathustra, all about a prophet who comes to earth to announce the death of God, who talks about the last man and the Übermenschen. And you read Friedrich Nietzsche. Friedrich Nietzsche is against Christianity and against communism because he sees them as ideologies for the inferior ones, whereas he worships the superior ones. Friedrich Nietzsche is the father of philosophical irrationalism. Philosophy is generally divided into, there's a lot of different debates in philosophy, okay? But there are two sides of a major debate. There are the rationalists and the irrationalists. The rationalists say the world is defined by order. The irrationalists say the world is defined by chaos. And that is what they are arguing about. And Friedrich Nietzsche was a philosophical irrationalist, saying that the world was defined by chaos, and arguing that attempts to impose a rational understanding onto the world lead to people being oppressed, and that great people define reality for themselves, right? Great people live according to no moral code. Great people decide for themselves what is right and wrong, and decide for themselves what is truth, and define truth with their intentions and with their wishes. And that Christianity and ideology itself, anything that is an attempt to oppose a rational system onto the world, is simply oppressing individuals, and that individuals can become great by not following anybody's rules, by living according to their own selfish desires. Right? Now, philosophical irrationalism of Friedrich Nietzsche, it says that compassion and kindness is for weaklings. It says that right and wrong don't really exist. It says truth doesn't really exist. And that the greatness of an individual is that with their willpower, they can define their own truth, they can define their own right and wrong, and they can work in their own self-interest. And that's how they're truly great. That's what Friedrich Nietzsche argues. That's called philosophical irrationalism. That is the religion of the Western world in our time. The Western world stopped being Christian a long time ago. And especially since World War II, philosophical irrationalism has become the religion of the collective West. You can quote me on that up and down. That is what we believe in the West. I don't believe that. You don't believe that. But the people in the government believe that. For a long time, the people in the government were neocons. They were neoconservatives. And I have the philosophical manifesto of neoconservatism right here. Leo Strauss, Persecution and the Art of Writing. Leo Strauss was a professor at New School University and at the University of Chicago, and he taught on philosophy. He taught Plato. And Leo Strauss taught, and he argues in this book, that all the great philosophers of history, Plato, Immanuel Kant, Descartes, they all had to write in code. They couldn't say what they really believed. Why? Because these stupid underlings, these stupid ordinary people would persecute them if they said what they really believed. They said what they really believed. And that there's certain people that are just better than everybody else. And Plato understood this, and in his book, The Republic, he called them the philosopher kings. And what we need to do is we need to create a society where the philosopher kings are not threatened by the underlings, where there's no persecution, and the great philosopher kings, the smart ones that are superior to everybody else, can define reality for themselves, define right and wrong for themselves, define existence, and live in a purely selfish manner. And that's the society we need, a society where the underlings, the inferior one, the lowly, don't get in the way of the elite. That is what Leo Strauss believes. And that, you know, talk about neocons, John Bolton, Irving Kristol, this is what they believe. Well, it's not just them. Go and read a book called The Fountainhead. Go and read a book called Atlas Shrugged, and what you will read is Nietzsche for Dummies. That is Nietzsche watered down for business school students, right? It's Friedrich Nietzsche. It's the same thing. The great men are the motor of the world, and they're great because nobody can tell them what's right and nobody can tell them what's wrong, and they don't play by anyone's rules, and they practice what Ayn Rand called the virtue of selfishness. The virtue of selfishness. It's not love your neighbor as yourself, right? It's not kindness. It's not, love kindness, do justice, and walk humbly with your God. No, it is the virtue of selfishness. And when Nietzsche talked about the Übermenschen, and Leo Strauss talked about the philosopher kings, and Ayn Rand talked about the great men, the motor of the world, they're all talking about themselves. And they're saying, I will not bow before God, I will not worship God, and I will not love my fellow man, and I will not have empathy. I am going to define right and wrong and reality itself for myself. I'm going to put myself in the place of God, and I will not allow anyone to interfere with me. And if somebody's hungry, screw them. That's their problem. And if somebody's homeless, that's not my problem. That's on them. They must be lowly and inferior. And if I hurt somebody else in order to get what I want, fuck them. That's on them. They must be a weakling that I was able to roll over them. That's what they believe. This is the religion of the Western world. I'm telling you, this is what is believed. This is what is believed by the right and the left. On the right, it's called Neoconservatism, and it is the followers of Leo Strauss, the regime change establishment right wing that seized control of the Republican Party after the John Birch Society and the old right was pushed out, after the Republican Party became dominated by people similar to, William F. Buckley and others. After the McCarthyite John Birch Society, old right, was pushed out, neoconservatism ascended, and that became the primary view among conservatives. And among leftists, it's called postmodernism. And it's the same thing. Postmodernism and neoconservatism are the same thing. And in fact, they studied under the same guy, Leo Strauss. Do you know who one of his students was? Susan Sontag. And do you know who else worked with Leo Strauss? Hannah Arendt. And in addition to that, while we're talking about it, who was the director of the CIA program that funded all the new left writing? Irving Kristol, who became the father of neoconservatism. The new left and the new right believe the same thing. They believe that right and wrong do not exist. They believe anyone who tries to tell you that right and wrong does exist is oppressing you and is totalitarian, and that the problem with totalitarianism, the problem with mass movements, the problem with ideology, the problem with Christianity, the problem with communism is it gets in their way. It gets in their way. It prevents them from ruling over us. It tells them that they have to follow rules, that they have to think about how we feel, that they have to have empathy, that if they hurt somebody else, that person has a right to retribution and has justice. That's why they can't stand it. They are against ideology. They are against right and wrong existing. They are against rationalism and order. They want complete chaos, and they worship rugged selfishness and individualism. And the right emphasizes the economic side of this, right? They believe in the free market, right? You're on your own. Society doesn't owe you a job. Society doesn't owe you health care. Society doesn't owe you anything. You're on your own, brother. Not my problem. The free market. And the left emphasizes social liberalism. You have no obligation to your family. You have no obligation to your country. You have no obligation to your community. You have no obligation to anybody, right? You're on your own. You can do your own thing, man. You're not a man. You're not a woman. There's no gender. There's no nothing. You can just be yourself. You're just an individual. You can define your own identity. You can be whatever you want to be. right? You can use drugs and you can do anything, and you don't owe anybody anything. You don't owe society anything. You have no truth that you should stand for. You have no loyalty. You have no principles that you should believe in. And it is a celebration of individualism. This is all called liberalism. This is the economic and political philosophy of liberalism, the celebration of individualism above all else, the atomization of mankind. This is what they believe. This is what they believe. And it's not simply a rejection of state coercion. And it's not simply a rejection of collectivism. It is a rejection of truth. Because truth is something that is beyond subjectivity. Truth is something that they have to acknowledge, whether they want to or not. And so there can't be any truth. And the postmodernists will tell you that. There is no grand narrative. There is no ideology. And any attempt to build a grand ideology is totalitarian and leads to people being oppressed. And I've got news for you all. Human beings need ideology. If you were driving down the road, as you're driving down the road, you know where you came from. You know where you're going. You know how you're getting there, and that's how you're driving down the road. But if you were to be driving down the road and you didn't know where you came from, you didn't know where you were going, you didn't know how you were getting there, you would have to stop the car. Because you didn't know where you don't know where you're coming from, you don't know where you're going, you don't know why you would have to stop the car. And in life and on this planet and being a human, you need a roadmap. You need to know where you came from. You need to know where you're going. You need to know how you're getting there. That's what ideology is. Ideology says, this is who you are. This is where you came from. This is what you're trying to achieve. It gives you the direction so that you can exist in this crazy world that we all have to live in. Human beings need ideology. And that's why every civilization that has ever existed has provided religion or some form of ideology. Ideology is an essential part of being a human. But ideology restricts the great ones. It restricts those philosopher kings. It restricts those great people who think they're superior to everybody else. It makes rules. Ideology makes rules. It says you can do some things, but you cannot do other things. It says some things are right and some things are wrong. It says some things are true and some things are not true. And that's what drives them crazy. That's what drives the leaders of the so-called collective West crazy. The rich and powerful elite, they don't like being told what they have to do. They want to just live according to their naked self-interest. They want to be able to just do what they feel they can do. They want to work in their own self-interest. They want to define reality based on whatever they feel it is. And they cannot stand ideology. And like Friedrich Nietzsche, for them, communism and Christianity are the same thing because they both say that right and wrong exists. They both say we have an obligation to our fellow man. They both don't argue that they can just do what they want. And postmodernism, Derrida, Arendt, Sontag, all of that stuff says the only morality is deconstruction, taking things apart. You shouldn't be teaching people ideology. You shouldn't be teaching people. You should be taking things apart. Don't build, wreck, tear things down. Be a deconstructionist. That's postmodern philosophy. And neoconservatism, on the other hand, says control them. Control the inferior ones. Make sure that they're kept in their place so they don't get in our way. Leo Strauss's favorite television show was Gunsmoke. He loved Gunsmoke because it was a 1950s Western where the good guy wore a white hat and he was all good. And the bad guy wore a black hat and he was all bad. There was not one single redeeming quality in the bad guy, and there was not one single flaw in the good guy. And Leo Strauss loved to watch Gunsmoke because he said that's what the masses, the inferior ones, the non-philosopher kings, that's how they should understand the world. They should think it's Gunsmoke. And we can work out the complexities for ourselves, but the masses, they need to watch Gunsmoke. That's Leo Strauss, the father of neoconservatism. Let the masses be sheep. Let them be silly. Let them be watered down. Let them be fools. And we'll work out reality. And on top of that, you have the postmodernists that say any grand narrative, any ideology is eventually going to lead to the sheep, the rabble getting together and trying to impose their will on us. And we can't allow that. We can't allow that to exist. So we have to do everything we can to oppose and deconstruct ideology so that we can maintain our freedom and not be restrained. And that is the big theme. The people who rule over us, they think they're better. They think that they're God. And their greatest fear is all of us getting together and saying, no, you're not. Right and wrong does exist. And you've got to treat people with respect, and you've got to follow certain rules, and you've got to be loyal to certain principles. They don't want that. They want to be selfish individuals who live according only to their own interest. That's what they want. So what does all this have to do with Good Friday? What does all of this have to do with Good Friday? Spent the first hour talking to you all about the Bible and the origins of Christianity and things like that. And now I'm ranting against philosophical irrationalism. What does all of this have to do with Good Friday? Well, you ever seen a crucifix? Have you ever seen a crucifix? I think you have. If you live in the West, you have. Maybe if you're watching from the Muslim world, you haven't seen one, but you probably saw one in a movie or on the internet or something. But, you know, the Catholic Church tends to use the crucifix as a symbol. It is an image of Jesus Christ being crucified. What is special about a crucifix? Jesus is nailed to a cross, suffering, bleeding, dying. But everyone who wears a crucifix, everyone who displays one, knows that is the King of Kings. That is God. That is the Messiah. Subjecting himself to a huge amount of suffering, allowing himself to be persecuted. because it's right. And that in and of itself is godlike. That's a level of strength and spiritual power to lay down one's life and to sacrifice for something so much bigger and to endure scorn and humiliation and persecution for a higher purpose. To be able to be tortured and degraded and killed because you know that there is another world beyond this material world, and that there are forces of good and evil, and that you must push forward to battle for the forces of good against all that is evil, and that you must suffer, and that it's worth it to suffer for something higher. It's worth it to suffer. It's worth it to sacrifice, to endure, to face opposition. It's worth it. Because in the end, you will triumph. Because in the end, you're working for something much bigger and much more powerful than any force on this world, any force on this planet. There's so much spiritual power in a crucifix. You look at a crucifix, boom. That symbol has so much power. And it is so much what human beings need to understand. That doing what's right isn't easy. Doing what's right brings persecution. Doing what's right brings condemnation. Doing what's right brings scorn. Doing what's right hurts. Doing what's right leads to you being humiliated. Doing what's right leads to you being degraded. Doing what's right leads to one of your followers saying, I don't know him. I don't know him. Doing what's right leads to somebody getting paid 30 pieces of silver to betray you. Doing what's right gets you nailed to a cross. Doing what's right gets you buried in a tomb. But Sunday morning comes, and the forces of righteousness prevail, and Satan is vanquished, and it's worth it. And without that understanding, without that image in our minds, without that power, there would be so few good things in this world. I argue that human beings are not animals. Human beings do not have a mere biological existence. We're not rats in a maze. We don't simply flee pain and pursue pleasure. We have a soul. We have the ability to take ownership. We have the ability to exercise judgment, to make decisions, to become aware of who we are and why we exist, to ask bigger questions, and to exercise agency. We have that ability. And that means that even if we get nailed to a cross for doing it, and even if we get persecuted, and even if we get betrayed, and even if we get stabbed in the back, we can still do what we understand with our rational minds is necessary to serve the world beyond, to serve the forces of righteousness. That we can transcend an animalistic existence, that we're more than our bodies, that we can suffer and endure and push back and fight against the evils of this world. And we can push forward the forces of righteousness, even when it seems that the whole world is against us. We can do this. That's what that symbol, that's what a crucifix says. It says we don't have to just be animals. We don't have to just go with the flow. We don't have to just do whatever is easy. No, we can fight. We can be persecuted. We can resist. We can find inner spiritual power. We have a soul. We have an existence beyond the material plane. We are connected to higher powers and higher sources. There's something beyond just our bodies. And that we can overcome the disgustingness and the simplicity and the pain and the banality of this world. And that we can be godlike. We can strive to be like our Father in heaven. We can strive to transcend our selfish, primitive, animalistic nature, and we can endure, and we can fight, and we can push back. And we can be beyond what this society tells us to be, beyond what we've been told we are to be. We can be great. If you think about what a crucifix means, it means something very, very powerful. And I'm going to read to you from this book. I think I will end my remarks here tonight by reading to you from this book. I'm going to read to you a chapter that has always spoken to me. And you can take from this whatever you want. I'm going to read to you Matthew chapter 10. And this is a chapter of the New Testament, of the Gospel of Matthew, that has always spoken to me and has given me inspiration and has gotten me through some of the hardest times in my life. I'm just going to read it to you. This is the King James Bible. This is Matthew chapter 10. And when he had called unto him his 12 disciples, he gave them power against certain unclean spirits, to cast them out, and to heal all manner of sickness and all manner of disease. Now the names of the 12 apostles are these: first Simon, who is called Peter, and Andrew his brother, James the son of Zebedee, and John his brother, Philip and Bartholomew, Thomas, Matthew the publican, James the son of Alphaeus, and Lebbaeus, whose surname was Thaddeus, Simon the Canaanite, and Judas Iscariot, who also betrayed him. The 12 Jesus sent forth and commanded them, saying, Go not in the way of the Gentiles, and into any city of the Samaritans enter ye not yet, but rather go to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. And as ye go, preach, saying, The kingdom of heaven is at hand. Heal the sick, cleanse the lepers, raise the dead, cast out devils. Freely ye have received, and freely give. Provide neither gold, nor silver, nor brass in your purses, nor scrip for your journey, neither 2 coats, neither shoes, nor yet staves, for the workman is worthy of his meat. And in whatsoever city or town ye shall enter, inquire who in it is worthy, and there abide till ye go thence. And when ye come into a house, salute it. And if a house be worthy, let your peace come upon it. But if it not be worthy, let your peace return to you. And whosoever shall not receive you, nor hear your words, when you depart out of that house or of that city, shake off the dust of your feet. Verily I say unto you, it shall be more tolerable for the land of Sodom and Gomorrah in the day of judgment than for that city. Behold, I send you forth as sheep in the midst of wolves. Be ye therefore wise as serpents and harmless as doves. But beware of men, for they will deliver you up to the councils, and they will scourge you in the synagogues. And ye shall be brought before governors and kings for my sake, for a testimony against them and the Gentiles. But when you deliver up, take no thought how or what ye shall speak, for it shall be given you in the same hour what ye shall speak. For it is not ye that speaketh, but the Spirit of your Father which speaketh in you. And the brother shall deliver up the brother to death, and the father the child, and the children shall rise up against their parents, and cause them to be put to death. And ye shall be hated by all men for my name's sake, but he that endureth to the end shall be saved. But when they persecute you in this city, flee ye into another. For verily I say unto you, ye shall not have gone over the cities of Israel until the Son of Man be come. The disciple is not above his master, nor the servant above his Lord. It is enough for the disciple that he be as his master, and the servant as his Lord. If they have been called master of the house Beelzebub, how much more shall they call them of his household? Fear them not, therefore, for there is nothing covered that shall not be revealed, and hid that shall not be known. What I tell you in the darkness, that speak ye in the light. And what ye hear in the ear, that preach ye on the housetops. And fear not them which kill the body, but are not able to kill the soul. But rather fear him which is able to destroy both soul and body in hell. Are not 2 sparrows sold for a farthing, and one of them shall not fall on the ground without your Father? But the very hairs of your head are all numbered. Whosoever shall confess me before men, him I will confess also before my Father which is in heaven. But whosoever shall deny me before men, him will I also deny before my Father which is in heaven. Think not that I am come to send peace on earth. I came not to send peace, but a sword. For I have come to set a man at variance against his father, and the daughter against her mother, and the daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law. And a man's foes shall be those of his own household. And he that loveth father or mother more than me is not worthy of me. And he that loveth son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me. And he that findeth his life shall lose it. And he that loseth his life for my sake shall find it. And he that receiveth me and he that receiveth you receiveth me. And he that receiveth me receiveth him that sent me. And he that receiveth a prophet in the name of a prophet shall receive a prophet's reward. And he that receiveth a righteous man in the name of a righteous man shall receive a righteous man's reward. And whosoever shall give to drink unto one of these little ones a cup of cold water only in the name of a disciple, verily I say unto you, he shall in no wise lose his reward. So take from that what you want, folks. I hope that this was inspirational. This channel is for everybody. I'll say this. This channel is for everybody. Anyone can watch this. It's public. You can come on here. You can watch this. And I hope that whoever you are watching this, whether you're watching this live or you're watching this afterwards, that you got something out of that. I think there's something there for you. And everything that I just said for the previous 1 hour and 46 minutes, and in particular in Matthew chapter 10, which I just read to you, I think there's something there for you. Not saying that all of it is something that will speak to you, but I think there's something there. So I appreciate you all for indulging me. I know religion is a very personal matter. People don't like to be preached at. People don't like to be, etc. So, it's pretty clear on the thumbnail what this stream is. I'm glad you're all here. I'm glad you're all watching, and I hope that we all can continue learning together. So thank you, everybody. Names and locations. I will call you all out as I see you. Names and locations. Who is with us tonight? Names and locations. Who is with us? Who is with us? Who is with us tonight? Names and locations. Who's with us? Who's with us? Who is with us? Names and locations. Who is with us tonight? Connor in Colorado is with us. Good to have you, Connor. Lawrence Johnson in Chicago. Deha in Seattle. AJ in New Jersey. Ryan in Kansas City. Rice from Adelaide, Australia. Joe in Durham. Andre in Toronto. Jenny in Cincinnati. Imran in Chicago. Hope you're coming to the convention, Imran. Jacob in Wisconsin. Scott in Maryland. Patrick in Maine. Northern Occupied Nick Rivera. Courtney in Northern Virginia, Alex in Brazil, Mariah in North Carolina, Conrad in Poland, Jersey Z, Priest of Hiroshima, Paul in Free Dairy. Welcome, Paul. Los Angeles County, Nico P. Are you coming to the LA workshop? Dan in Los Angeles, Briggy in Pennsylvania, Northern Occupied Mexican Territory of Texas, Jersey X, Gabriel in Peru. Welcome, Gabriel. Names and locations, folks. Names and locations. Who is with us tonight? Names and locations. Names and locations. Anybody else? Mikhail in Canberra. Welcome, Mikhail. Names and locations. Names and locations. Names and locations. Anybody else? Names and locations tonight. Who is with us tonight? Names and locations. Names and locations. Names and locations. Who is with us? Claire in Britain. Welcome, Claire. Names and locations, names and locations. Anybody else? Phil in Florida. Phil Sang in Florida. Welcome, Phil Sang in Florida. Names and locations. Anybody else? Anybody else? Names and locations, names and locations, names and locations, names and locations, names and locations. Anybody else? Anybody else? Names and locations. Anyone else? Okay. Anybody else? Names and locations. If not, we have actually a great message that was recorded by one of our great CPI members who lives in Minneapolis, and that's Penny. So this is Penny's great message about cheese. So here we go.
Here at the Wedge Co-op in Minneapolis, you will find a variety of delicious cheeses. My favorite are the cheese sticks. They're so creamy, not rubbery like supermarket brands. The Wedge supports local farmers and local charities. They also gladly accept government-subsidized payments from low-income families, such as WIC and EBT. Business is business, right? Don't tell Elon. Speaking of government subsidies, why is our government storing 1.4 billion pounds of cheese in a cave in Springfield, Missouri? Who really benefits from this? Working families? Small farmers? Or Kraft, which is a multi-million-dollar corporation? What would happen if the government gave all that cheese away? Come find out at our July 12th convention in Chicago. Working families first, defeat the deep state.
All right. All righty. So what she's referring to there is the fact that there's a cave in Springfield, Missouri, where there's billions of dollars worth of cheese, and that's to keep the price of dairy high enough that the farm and the agribusiness companies don't go out of business. It's a government subsidy, and this is something that points to the irony of capitalism, right? I mean, is that there's not enough wages paid out in the process of making cheese to buy enough cheese. And this is a constant problem. And this is something that we have talked about on here endlessly, this issue with the fact that poverty is created by abundance. We should be living in a world with no poverty right now. We should be living in a world that is more peaceful and prosperous than ever before. But yet, because we have an irrational system where production is defined by profit, the more abundance we create, the poorer people get. It doesn't make any sense. Poverty should not be created by abundance. I'm actually going to put on this video. This is my video on this topic where I talk about the cheese cave. I'm going to put that on as well. Then I will answer any questions that people have, but I don't see any super chats. No one sent me any Cash App super chats, and I don't see any Rumble rants. So, we might be ending this pretty soon. But if you have anything you want me to talk about, send a Rumble rant or send a super chat. So here we go. Ready to answer your questions.
Explain what needs to be explained, what used to be considered Marxism 101, about why it is that our Western capitalist economy is crashing and burning. And in order to do that, I'm going to have to do some math. And I hate math. You know why I hate math? Because I grew up in America. I went to public school in the United States of America. So I am going to, at risk of embarrassing myself, because math was never my best subject, I am going to do some mathematics here on the board for you to explain the problem.
We very much enjoyed Caleb's speech.
So if you are creating a product, right? If you're a factory owner, you're making a product, you are going to need the material through which that product is made, the manufacturing materials. So that'll be A.
The simple equation he put forward to explain the crisis of overproduction and the falling rate of profit.
And you're probably going to need to transport the product to where it's sold. That's B.
It broke down where your money goes.
You're also going to have to pay your labor costs. Labor costs are represented by C.
Explanations of those concepts that people are able to understand.
Then when consumers purchase the product, they're going to pay a final price. And that final price is D. However, there's a problem with that.
I like the fact that he framed it that way to make it very clear.
Which is that the capitalist can't change how much A costs. He can't change how much B costs. So the profit of the capitalist can only be extracted from the value put into it by the worker. And this is the basis of Marxism, the understanding of surplus value.
I've never seen it explained so simply anywhere. I've never been able to explain it that simply.
So C, the labor value, is divided. You have C1, which is what the worker actually gets paid. And then you have C2, which is the profit that the capitalist makes. And it all adds up to D, which is the final cost of the product. Now, the way people in the United States who talk about Marxism generally talk about this is they say, well, this is unfair. They say the worker is not getting paid the full value of his labor. But they're missing one of the most important points, which is not just that it's unfair and then people argue, well, what about the employer? He put up the money, doesn't he deserve to be? That's all a distraction. Because the important thing to understand is this. C1 is always going to be less than D. The wages paid out to the worker are never enough to buy back the product that he produces. There is always more products created than there are wages paid out to the worker. And this is the built-in problem of capitalism, the problem of overproduction. And it is always there in the capitalist economy. It never goes away. And they have invented all kinds of crazy mechanisms to try and deal with the problem of overproduction. Part of the reason that the US government has purchased billions and billions of dollars worth of cheese only to bury it in a cave in Springfield, Missouri, is to deal with this problem. It is an ongoing present problem, and it's a problem acknowledged by most capitalist economists. John Maynard Keynes said the problem was underconsumption rather than overproduction, but he was pointing to the same problem. The military-industrial complex in the United States is an effort to deal with this problem, to keep spending going. There's all kinds of mechanisms that they've invented to try and resolve this problem, but it gets worse. What is the capitalist always trying to do? He wants to maximize the amount of profit he makes. And one of the main ways they do that is with what's called labor-saving technology. Get rid of workers and replace workers with machines. As they eliminate workers from the process of production, as there's fewer and fewer workers involved, as machines take the place of workers, the role of C in production decreases. There's a little bit of a problem with that. As C goes down, C2 also goes down, right? As C decreases, C2 also decreases. And as the role of the worker in production is reduced, the rate of profit that the capitalist makes goes down. And this is called the tendency of the falling rate of profit. Only human labor creates value. And this is something that Adam Smith acknowledged. This is something some of the popes even acknowledge. Human labor creates all value. And so when you reduce the role of human labor in production, the amount of value created decreases, and the ability of the capitalist to extract surplus value also decreases. So this causes the capitalist to have to churn out even more products because he's making less and less of a profit on the overall product. He's making less and less of a percentage, so he has to churn them out. So this problem of the worker never being able to buy back what he produces and more products being created than are necessary, this problem becomes exacerbated. And this points to what is understood to be the deeply irrational nature of the capitalist system.
All righty. So I do have a few Rumble rants that have come in. So we're going to answer them one by one. I think 3 of them are from Hempcar, and they are on religious questions. And there's one that just came in from Violent Femme. So Hempcar says, didn't Jesus focus on reforming the Pharisees and Sadducees opposed to Rome? Jesus said a coin had Caesar's face on it, so give it to him. So during Jesus's lifetime, he tended to focus on trying to convince Jews to change their ways. And his main criticism was of what was called legalism. right? This is very important, right? There's many, this was really the primary beef that Jesus had with the Pharisees, which were one of the main sects at the time. There's the story of Pharisee confronts Jesus and says to Jesus, which of the 10 commandments is the greatest? And he replies, the greatest commandment is to love your God with all your heart and soul and mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. And all the law of the prophets depends on that. And, he's saying that, it's not which of the 10 commandments is the most important. It's that behind the 10 commandments is love your neighbor as yourself and love your God with all your heart, soul, and mind. And that's the essence of what the 10 commandments are about. Another thing that happens is that Jesus goes around healing people on the Sabbath, which you're not supposed to do any work on the Sabbath. And the Pharisees confront him about healing people on the Sabbath. And they say, why are you healing people on the Sabbath? And he says, the Sabbath was made for man. Man was not made for the Sabbath, meaning that these rules, these archaic rules that you're enforcing, they're not the point. The point is what is right and wrong. It's not about following the letter of the law. It's about doing what is right. Right? And that if you're focused on the letter of the law, you miss the essence, which is you need to love your neighbor as yourself, and you need to be connected with God, and you need to love your God. And that the law, etc., is all based on trying to get people to treat each other right and not abuse each other, and getting people to be connected with God and with the higher power. But that's the point. It's all about loving God and loving your neighbor as yourself. It's not about whether or not you cross the I and dot the T. And the Pharisees are caught up in which of the 10 commandments is the most important. Do you heal people on the Sabbath? That's what they're caught up in, and they're missing the point. And that comes up over and over and over again. They are obsessed with the trees, and they're missing the forest, right? And that legalism, Judaism in his day had been overcome by legalism. And that's what he's ranting against. And that after Jesus's death, right, when he gives the Great Commission to the disciples in the book of Acts, he then says, go and make disciples of all nations. So, as I just read to you in Matthew 10, he's saying, go to the Jews, go to the Jews, the lost sheep of Israel. But after his death, he then says, go and make disciples of all nations. And that is another major difference between Christianity and Judaism, is that Judaism doesn't recruit as a religion. Jews don't go around saying, become a Jew. They don't do that, right? You're born into it. And, to become a Jew is like a process. You have to ask 3 times. There's a whole process to become a Jew, but you're really not supposed to. You're supposed to be born into it. Whereas Christianity was all about recruiting, right? It was go and make disciples of all nations, win people over. And eventually they got rid, and that if you read the epistles of Paul, they got rid of one of the major barriers to recruitment, which was circumcision. To become a Jew, you had to get circumcised. And, if you want to not recruit a lot of adult men to join your religion, tell them that part of signing up is you have to get circumcised. Ain't going to happen. And that's why Paul wrote about spiritual circumcision. He said, actually, you don't have to get circumcised. And circumcision is an essential part of Judaism, right? That's kind of how the religion started. Abraham said, we're going to start circumcising. So when Apostle Paul says circumcision is no longer necessary, at that point, they're already saying that the 10 commandments are kind of nullified by love your neighbor as yourself and love your God with all your heart and soul. And then they're saying you don't have to get circumcised. And then Jesus proclaimed himself to be superior to all the Hebrew prophets. And that's also very important, right? At one point in the book of John, Jesus is being confronted by the Pharisees, and he says, I'm older than Moses. And they say, how can you be older than Moses? You're not even 40 years old. And how can you be older than Moses? He says, before Moses was, I And he's saying that basically he's superior to all the Hebrew prophets, and that they all, he said, like Moses is rejoicing for the day that I came. And he's saying it's a new religion, right? Christianity is a new religion at that point. It's not Judaism. And that's the important part. You're not getting circumcised. If you're saying Jesus is superior to Abraham, superior to Moses, superior to all of them, if you're saying the 10 Commandments don't really matter, if you're saying that the Sabbath was made for man was not made for the Sabbath, and that you can heal people on the Sabbath, that's fine. If you're saying it's far more important to love your neighbor as yourself and love God than it is to follow the letter of the 10 Commandments, at that point, it's a new religion. And the term Christian actually was a slur. It was a slur originally, but it eventually caught on. So there you go. It's pretty wild. But it was considered a wing of Judaism, but it got to the point what they were doing was so different than Judaism that they just had to be something new, because they were not practicing Judaism. They were practicing a whole new religion. So there we go. Next question. Hempcar says, why don't Muslims believe Jesus was crucified? Well, I'm not a Muslim, and I'm not here to speak for Muslims. And so forgive me if I get this wrong. My understanding is that Muslims believe Jesus was crucified. They just don't believe he died. I think they believe there was some kind of miracle where he didn't die on the cross, right? Where I think that he was on the cross, and then like a miracle occurred where Barabbas replaced Jesus. There was like a switch. So Jesus didn't die, right? That's what they believe. They believe he was crucified, but then they believe that then there was a miracle and Barabbas ended up dying on the cross, not Jesus. And they believe Jesus was a prophet for the Jews. They believe Jesus was a prophet sent for the Jews, and that every nation, my understanding is at least Shia. I don't know that much about different forms of Judaism. I have studied Shia, or different forms of Islam. I have studied Shia Islam quite a bit because I spent a lot of time in Iran. And my understanding is that Shia Muslims believe that every nation was given prophets prior to Muhammad. And that there were like thousands of prophets that came before Muhammad. And then Muhammad was the last prophet for all mankind. Muhammad was not for one race. He was for all mankind. And so they recognize that Ibrahim, they call him Moses, Jesus, they were all prophets for the Jews. And they consider Jesus to have been a prophet for the Jews. And then they argue Muhammad was given the Quran, which is the verbatim word of God, and he's the last prophet for all mankind. And one thing about Muslims is that if you believe there are any more prophets after Muhammad, you're not a Muslim, right? That is considered the main form of apostasy in Islam, is if you believe that any prophet came after Muhammad received the Quran, then you're not a Muslim. Now, I am not a Muslim, and there are Muslims watching this right now who probably think I'm butchering this, and that they're absolutely right, because I'm not a Muslim. I don't have any right to tell people what you believe. I'm telling you, as a non-Muslim who has spent a lot of time in the Middle East, who has read a lot, I'm telling you my understanding of what Muslims believe. But ask a Muslim. Don't ask me, because a Muslim will get it right. And Islam, just like every other religion, there are different interpretations. And I will say, it's taken me a long time to be as religious as I'm being tonight, right? When I was a kid, I was really sick of talking about religion, because I grew up around a lot of people for whom religion was their excuse to be stupid. One thing that has always bothered me, let me just throw this out there, is when people are revisionists, but they do not know that which they are revising, right? It's like every religion has unique interpretations of the faith, right? But if you don't know the original, and I mean, I see this in many different schools of life, but like classic example was when I was growing up, it just annoyed the crap out of me. People would say, "Are you Catholic or Christian?" And I would say to them, Catholicism is a form of Christianity. Be like, no, it's not. They worship Mary, not Jesus. I'd be like, yeah, but they think they're Christians. Okay, I get it. You think they're not real Christians because you're an evangelical. That's your right. But they didn't know that Catholics considered themselves to be Christians. And it was like, and I would explain to them, no, Catholics consider themselves to be Christian. I had one girl say, well, no, they're Romans. They're Roman Catholics. They worship the people who killed Jesus. They worship the Romans. I'm like, no. And it was like they didn't understand that, yes, their religion argued that Catholics were not genuine Christians. Okay, they have a right to believe that. But Catholicism is considered a form of Christianity, and Catholics consider themselves to be Christian. But these people didn't know that. And so they walk around, are you Christian or Catholic? And it's like, duh, and it's like, if you want to take the position, I respect that. But if you don't know, they wouldn't know that Catholics consider themselves to be Christian. It was infuriating to deal with. They don't know the whole story. If you've studied Catholicism and you've studied Christianity and you come to the conclusion that Catholics are not real Christians, that's fine. But if you don't know anything and you're just like, are you Catholic or Christian? Shut up. It's just, I hate stuff like that. But I see the exact same thing among communists. I was in the Workers' World Party for 8 years. And this is one thing that I saw the exact same silliness in the Workers' World Party. One thing, for example, right? If you ask Workers' World Party members, if you say to them, what is fascism? They'll give you this speech that they think is so profound. And they'll be like, well, we respect the right of anyone, any oppressed person, to call somebody a fascist, even if it's not legitimately correct, and they would say it in like this really cool, like we're saying this profound thing. We respect the right of oppressed people to call somebody a fascist, even if they're not. And they would, okay, all right, but what actually is fascism? And they couldn't tell you. And what that came from is that when the Black Panthers in 1969, right, we're going way far back, when the Black Panthers in 1969 formed an organization called the United Front Against Fascism, to oppose Richard Nixon. Sam Marcy was from a Trotskyite tradition. He didn't consider Richard Nixon to be a fascist, but they took the position of just kind of repeating what the Black Panthers were saying, because they wanted to support the Black Panthers. So they said, well, the Black Panthers have the right to say that. But these Workers' World Party members did not know. They could not tell you what fascism actually was. They just had this really cool talking point. And it's like they knew the revision, but they don't know the original. And I've seen that. Another thing that happened, this was an infuriating thing. I remember sitting there and just being like, are you serious? All right. One of the main achievements of the Chinese Communist Party is they got rid of foot binding, right? Before the Chinese Revolution, women in China that, were, from wealthy upper classes or were prostitutes, they had their feet crushed when they were children, right? And they had little tiny feet, right? It was called foot binding, a very barbaric practice that was a horrible thing that was done to make women sexy, right? It was considered, when women to have like feet like children, to have their feet never grow into adult size, was considered to be very sexually appealing. And so wealthy Chinese women and prostitutes in China, that was a thing that happened. It was very wrong. It was very awful. And the Chinese Communist Party, they said women hold up half the sky, and they outlawed foot binding, right? Very cool. Good that they did that. Well, I sat through a lecture one time, and where it was supposed to be about women's rights in China. It was an older woman who had been a Maoist. She'd been in Maoist groups. And she was given this lecture. And I can tell before the lecture, they had told her, when she mentions foot binding, make sure that you say that that China's not the only society that did bad things to women. So she gets up there and she says, before the Chinese Revolution, women had their foot binding, but there's genital mutilation in Africa, and there's, domestic violence and rape in America, and there's evil exploitive pornography. She never got to the part where China got rid of it. She never got to the part about how the Chinese communists got rid of foot binding. She was so busy apologizing for mentioning foot binding and doing the like, well, we're careful how we talk about the foot binding thing. She never actually got to the point, which was that the Chinese communist. So it almost sounded like she was defending foot binding. She's like, yeah, they used to bind women's feet in China, but all these other societies do bad things to women. And she never got to the part about the Chinese Communist Party is good for getting rid of it. I'm sitting there, I'm just like, do you hear yourself? No one in this room has ever heard of foot binding. You sound like you support foot binding. And like she literally sounded like she supported foot binding. And I was just like, are you like, but it's again, she understands the revisionism, which is we're careful how we talk about it and we make it sound like it's not a uniquely Chinese thing. But you have to know the original, which is the whole reason you're talking about it, which is that they did this before the communists came to power in China and they got rid of it. That's the fucking point. And there's nothing that annoys me more than when people know the revision, but they don't know the actual thing, right? It'd be like reading the fan fiction of a story and you never read the original, right? I mean, it's like, and it's like, so it's like you're walking around, are you Catholic or Christian? Well, no, Catholics think they're Christian, okay? If you think they're not real Christians, that's fine, but you need to understand Christianity 101. One of the main forms of Christianity is called Catholicism. If you think it's phony, I respect that, but you have to know the first part. You have to know the first part before you go there, right? And if somebody says, you know, oh, fascism, well, what is fascism? Well, I respect the right of anyone. Okay, but what is fascism? You have to know what fascism is first before you can say you respect the right of people to get it wrong, right? And I see this in so many places. Another example, I saw this. This is like a leftist example. This wasn't in the communist group I was in. This is just an example. There's an activist group. There was an activist group in the 1960s called Students for a Democratic Society. It was like the main activist group in the 1960s. You know, they did the Columbia University student protests and Kent State, and they were just the main radical leftist activist group that existed in the in the 1960s, early 60s to late 60s. You had this group called Students for a Democratic Society. It was just a big group, and it started by liberals, but by the end it turned into it was communist dominated by the end, and it collapsed in 1969. Some of them became terrorists and whatever. That was Students for a Democratic Society. So years later, fast forward to the 21st century, there was some people that wanted to start a new club at their college. They wanted to call Students for a Democratic Society, right? In honor of the 1960s one. And this girl at their college says, that's a sexist group. And she was angry that a sexist group was organizing on their campus. Why? Because there's a lot written about how SDS was dominated by men, how, there was stuff in SDS that wasn't good. But it's like, she doesn't know the original, right? She doesn't know that SDS was the main activist group among peace activists, civil rights activists in the 1960s. She doesn't know that. All she's read is the revisionism of the feminists in the 70s saying SDS was bad. And so she's like, SDS is a sexist group. It's like, no, SDS was a communist-led activist group in the 60s that had, that people have criticized for being sexist. But it's like, she never learned the first part. She just learned the criticism. I mean, it's like, no, like she literally believed that SDS was this group of people that were formed. Let's go around oppressing women. I mean, it's just like, you have to learn, you have to see the first movie before you watch the second movie. Okay. Right. And I just, in every aspect of life, I see this as a problem, right? I had a very intense argument once with a girl at my school who was a Baptist, and she insisted she wasn't a Protestant. And I said, you're not Orthodox. You're not Catholic. You are a Protestant. She said, no, I'm not. Protestants are part of the Catholics. I said, Protestants are not part of the Catholics. They broke away from the Catholics. And it wasn't until years later, I was listening to a sermon by a fundamental Baptist preacher, I understood what she was trying. Fundamental Baptists insist they are not Protestants, right? They say that Protestantism is like tainted by Catholicism. Okay, fine. But she didn't know that, right? And so she told me, no, I'm not Protestant. Protestants are just like Catholics. I'm like, no, they're not. Like, there is a very complex theological argument that fundamental Baptists make, where they insist, well, we're not actually Protestants because Protestantism is like rooted in Catholicism, and we are just so different from that. We're not Protestant. They say that. But they know they're considered largely to be Protestants. They know that the Protestant church broke from the Catholic Church. They know that generally you have Orthodox, Catholic, Protestant, and then they say, well, technically, we don't want to consider ourselves to be Protestants. We're our own thing. But, like, I remember having this argument. She insisted she was not a Protestant. She was not a Protestant because the Protestants are just like the Catholics. No, they are not. Like, and it's like, again, you can write the fan fiction, you can write the criticism, you can revise if you know the original. But if you don't know what you're revising, I mean, and there's many examples of this where, again, all this girl at the college had read was feminists writing about how SDS had sexism in it, not understanding that the whole reason those feminists were writing about that was because SDS was this big communist group that was on all the college campuses. But she didn't know that part. She just knew that in her feminism class, she read a book about how SDS was sexist. So clearly somebody set up a group on her campus to go around oppressing women. Right? The big picture. I will say this. In my writing, one thing I always try to do is assume that my audience knows nothing and give them the big picture, because very little writing does that, right? You assume the reader knows this, or you don't want you want your reader to think you're smart. No, right? If you're a serious activist, if you're a serious teacher, right? If you're serious, if you want people to be better by what you're writing, don't try to impress them with how smart you are, and don't assume they know anything. Tell them what they need to know. Good writing tells you what you need to know. That's why I read the Wall Street Journal. I cannot stand the New York Times. Why? Because the New York Times is written for snobs. Everyone who writes the New York Times, it's like they're showing it. I have to read 3/4 of the article before I figure out what the goddamn article is about. Whereas when I open the Wall Street Journal, boom, tells me right there what I need to know. Right? The New York Times, it's all writers trying to impress you with how amazing writers they are. And, this. Yeah. Whereas Wall Street Journal is just like, this is what happened. It serves its purpose as a newspaper. I open the Wall Street Journal to read the news. I don't open the New York Times because I'm not interested in learning about how smart all the people who wrote articles for it are and making them feel good about themselves. Right? I don't find the New York Times to be readable or helpful. It doesn't serve its purpose as a newspaper. Right? If I want to be impressed, I'll read literary magazines or something. But anyway, writers need to be humble. Right? That is, Hollywood, right? This comes up in Hollywood a lot. I'll get to the next questions. I'll get to Deha and others. But there's certain movies that you see, movies from the late 70s. Saturday Night Fever is unwatchable, right? It's a lot of boomers' favorite movie, but it's unwatchable. It just goes on and on and on. And there's a dance contest and somebody falls off the bridge. And I mean, it's just this movie that just goes on and on and on. Pretty in Pink. That's a movie from like the early 80s or something like that. It's the same way. It's unwatchable. It just goes on and on and on. Right? It's 1986. It's that late. Okay. What it was writers had too much power during those years. Right? And that when writers have too much power, they stop doing their job and they want all their friends to be impressed. They want you to think that they are smart. That's a really big problem with writers. And I say this as a writer, right? I know this, right? Because you're writing, that's your work. So you want people to be impressed with it. The problem is, though, right? And I mean, I have to guard against this too. The problem is that if you are so caught up in this is my creation, you lose the functionality of your writing, right? When you go to get your hair cut, you're not concerned with the world knowing how great your barber is. You just want a haircut that looks nice, right? If you were to hire a carpenter to, build a deck on your house, would you want the world to know how smart and skilled and brilliant that carpenter was? Or would you want a nice deck that was comfortable for your house, right? And that anything that is artistic can lose its functionality, and that's a danger. That's a danger with that. And but anyway, how did we get to that? I don't know. Anyway, let's get back to the questions. Back to the questions. All right. Oh, we got another one here. All right. Okay. Okay. Didn't Jesus try to reform the Pharisees and Sadducees, not Rome? I think we already did that one, right? And why do Muslims not believe he was crucified? Yeah, we talked about that already. Okay. Next is Violent Fembot. What do you think of the New York Times story claiming Tulsi, J.D. Vance, and Pete Hegseth talked Trump out of backing an Israeli track on Iran? I think it's true. I believe it. And I think that's great. I think that absolutely made sense. And that it's really good we have Tulsi Gabbard there. And that, again, I never told you Trump was going to be a savior on a white horse. El Salvador, awful, horrible. Bombing Yemen, horrible. Deporting students for their political beliefs, horrible. Not bombing Iran, good. Not going along with Israel, good, right? Not bombing. I mean, we're slightly better off with Trump. Without Trump, we wouldn't be negotiating with Iran. Without Trump, there wouldn't have been a 30-day ceasefire. Without Trump, we probably would have, Netanyahu would have bombed Iran. Without Trump, we definitely wouldn't be negotiating with Russia right now. Yeah, Trump's doing a lot of bad stuff. The Doge, there's loads that you can complain about, and I agree with your complaints. You are absolutely right. But it would be worse with Kamala Harris in that we probably wouldn't have a planet. I'd probably be in prison. It would be basically illegal to be an anti-imperialist. I'll say one thing that is interesting to me, right? And I'm just throwing this out there. It's not right, okay? So please do not misquote me as saying this is right. I did not say this is right. It's just a fact. I think one of the major differences between the Trump administration and the Biden administration is that Trump believes that if you are not a U.S. citizen, you don't have rights. And he believes that if you are not a U.S. citizen, you don't have right to free speech. If you're against what Israel's doing, you're out of the country. He believes that if you're not a U.S. citizen, I can send you to a prison in El Salvador because whatever. He believes if you're not a U.S. citizen, you don't have rights. I don't agree with that. I believe our Constitution says that persons, everyone in the country has rights just by being here, right? You have freedom of speech. I don't think you need a citizenship card to have rights. That said, I think Joe Biden didn't believe any of us have rights because Joe Biden had the FBI raid the home of the Uhuru movement. They're U.S. citizens, but he wanted to throw them in prison for their free speech. Joe Biden set up the Global Engagement Center that engaged in all kinds of government-funded smear operations against U.S. citizens. Well, Trump, Pam Bondi, who is the attorney general under Trump, has said no more of this Foreign Agent Registration Act stuff. That's only used against foreign citizens who are engaging in spying. Well, that's right there, right? If you're an American citizen, you got free speech. And they got rid of the Global Engagement Center. Why? They said it was smearing American citizens. That seems to be the difference between the Trump administration and the Biden administration. Biden didn't think anybody had any rights. Trump, on the other hand, thinks only American citizens have rights. Well, I would like everyone to have rights, but some people having rights is better than nobody having rights, right? I don't know. The other thing, and I've said this before, and again, who cares? I'm not going to win any popularity contests with these people, but Mahmoud Khalil, I support him on principle. He should not be kicked out of the country for his Palestine activism. That said, Mahmoud Khalil is a spook. Okay? He is, right? And that's obvious. He was involved in trying to overthrow the Syrian government. He was operating out of Lebanon, and he was working. He's a spook. And the Democrats are very, very intelligence connected. Okay? And that they were not going to deport Mahmoud Khalil because he's doing a favor for the intelligence agencies, and he's intelligenced up, right? And the Democrats are very, very much, there's almost like when they talk about the deep state, there's things the U.S. government would like to do that it can't do because it's got this elaborate intelligence network, and there's this elaborate intelligence 4D chess game going on, okay? Trump is coming in there and he's saying, you know what, no 4D chess, right? We hate the Palestine protesters just like Biden did. So I don't care if Mahmoud Khalil is working with intelligence, get him out of the country, right? Well, Biden kind of wanted to do that too, but he probably, thought, I'm going to go, I can't do that because he's tied in with so-and-so and we're using him to overthrow. And, Trump is like, I don't care. Same for MS-13 and Tren de Aguila. Right? This is a gang in Venezuela, a horrible, horrible gang that the U.S. government has been using to try and overthrow Maduro. And MS-13, horrible, horrible gang in Mexico that the CIA and has been using, and they're infiltrated and all kinds of drug smuggling and stuff. And there's a lot of people in the policing agencies, a lot of people in the FBI and the Department of Justice that are just like, let's crush Tren de Aguila, let's crush them. And they couldn't because Biden's like, wait, using them to try and overthrow Maduro. Can you just let them do their stuff, right? We're gonna, and there's Trump is just like, no, crush them. They're now a terrorist group, and I'm sending them to El Salvador. Okay, right? And MS-13, right? There's a lot of local cops around the country that see all the evil things MS-13 is doing. They know where they're working, and they want to go arrest them. But the police chief says, nope, got to make a phone call. Nope, the feds say we can't touch them. Why? Well, because we're using them to, intervene in Mexico's politics and disappear socialist activists and oh no, well, Trump is like, screw that, they're terrorists, I'm deporting them. So there's an element of like unilateral action of not getting involved in these big intelligence long-term schemes. Mahmoud Khalil is a pawn in a big intelligence scheme. Trump, as a favor to the Zionists, is like, I don't give a fuck about that. Get him out of the country, right? Tren de Aguila, the MS-13, they're pawns and they're elaborate. They're basically what you call non-state actors or counter gangs. That's basically what they are, right? They're very big, well-developed, drug cartels and criminal organizations that are big. And the Brzezinski approach is let's nudge the non-state actors, use them against our enemies, manipulate them. That's their strategy, right? That's how the liberals operate, right? Al-Qaeda, right, was like, we set up this terrorist network in Afghanistan to fight against the Soviet Union, and we nudged them, and then they turned around and attacked us, right? Well, that's the Brzezinski soft power strategies. We cultivate non-state actors and counter gangs, and we manipulate them, and we feed them disinformation, and we use them, and it seems like the Trump folks are just like, no, these are dangerous drug cartels. These are dangerous terrorists. We don't want to use them. We want to get them out of our goddamn country. I mean, there's an element of that I can respect. I just don't think our civil liberties should be violated. I don't think anyone should be sent out of the country without due process. I don't think anyone should be sent out of the country for their political views. So I don't totally respect it, but that's what the difference is. That when Trump talks about globalists, he's talking about this this kind of like long-term intelligence game that the deep state likes to play, and Trump and a lot of the people with him just don't want to play those games anymore. So there you go. And that's kind of a very nuanced thing to understand, but there you go. All right. Too often leftists shun Christianity as an oppressive religion, seeing it as having no place in leftist spaces. So thank you for inclusivity of Christianity as part of revolutionary action. Well, look, thank you, Deha. And there would be no Marxism without Christianity. I mean, there wouldn't be. Karl Marx, he defined Christianity. He defined the higher stage of communism. He said, from each according to his own ability and to each according to his needs. That comes from the book of Acts. The disciples, and they laid everything at the disciples' feet, and distribution was given according to every man, according to his needs. It comes from the Bible. Communism says that, before class society emerged, we were hunter-gatherers and we were like in balance with nature. And then we got intelligent and we started hunting and gathering and things, the origin of private property. And it's like we have this original sin. And then out of that emerges the greatest class in history, the proletariat. And the proletariat is going to have a big epic battle. And then communism is like secularized Christianity in a lot of ways. And I think Nietzsche is right about that. I just think it's good. Right. But I also believe you can't build heaven on earth without God. Right. You can't build heaven on earth without God. And that it's an overcorrection. Right. That, in feudalism, everything was defined by religion. Everything was spiritual. So in Marx's time, everything was scientific. And they're all, and that's how these things go, right? In feudalism, everything was defined by spirituality. Everything was defined by religion. So as feudalism is overturned, in Marx's day, everything new and exciting was scientific, right? Marx calls his form of socialism scientific socialism, right? As opposed to utopian socialism. It's modern, it's scientific. How is it scientific? Did Friedrich Engels and Karl Marx do an experiment? No. And when you talk to Marxists, right, what they mean by it's scientific is it's based on reality. That's not what scientific means. And that's one of the problems. It becomes kind of a thing that Marxists just say. It's part of their like mantra. Oh, with our scientific socialism and our scientific dialectical materialist understanding of, and they just say that before they say anything, right? You can get up and say, we must vote for Joe Biden. With my dialectical scientific understanding, I have concluded that we must vote for Joe Biden. No, you didn't do an experiment to figure that out. What does that have to do with dialectical materialism? There's a contradiction and a thesis and an antithesis, and that has nothing to do with science, has nothing to do with dialectical materialism. That's your opinion. But if you're a Marxist, you're up there with I got to do it this way. With my scientific philosophy, with my materialist dialectical understanding of the science, I have concluded that we must vote for Joe Biden because this is in the interest of the international proletariat. And as in the interest of the international proletariat, we must vote for Biden, as this will advance the contradictions of the dialectic. Give me a break. I don't fuck with this. I'm here to actually teach you shit. I want you to be smarter for listening to me. I don't play silly games like that. I'm not here to put on a stupid show for you. Right? And I'm not here to put on a show and like get you to think I'm smart. I want you to actually learn what I'm talking to you about. All right? I want you to know what imperialism is. I want you to know what capitalism is. I'm trying to make you smarter. I'm trying to get you to wake up. Wake up. Wake up. That's what I'm trying to do. You're asleep. We have a society that lulls you to sleep. They want you to be living biologically, to be like a rat in a maze, just going along. And, I smell some cheese going this way. And I'm here to say, wake up. You're a human. You're a human. And you have agency. And you have creative power and ability. You can do right or do wrong. You can ask why you're here. You can understand the system and the world around you, and you can alter the world. And you can engage in operations to try and change the world around you. That's what I'm here to do. I'm not here to put on a stupid show for you and keep you asleep. Right? And that's what demagogues do. That's what phonies do. And there are some certain demagogues and phonies that should come into your mind immediately that don't teach their people shit. And it's a crime. right? They don't teach their people anything. They just get up there and they put on a stupid show. Well, I'm not here to put on a stupid show. You want a stupid show? Go watch Netflix. There's loads of stupid shows on Netflix. I'm here to wake you up. Wake up! Wake up! That's what I'm here to do. Read What is Innovationism. Read What is Innovationism. This is a short booklet, and you'll learn all about what we're trying to do. Innovationism is about waking you up to understand your creative ability, to not live biologically, but to harness your creative power, to join a collective of people, to try and force the world to change, to carry out operations to actually change the world. The point is to actually win. Not to feel good on the internet, not to be smart, not to have fun, not to be able to tell all your friends that you're this or you're that. The point is to win. The point is to win. The point is to actually change the world around us and nudge it in the direction of right. And to do that, we need an organization and we need to carry out operations. And that's why we need you in Chicago. We need you in Chicago. We need you in Chicago. See you in Chicago, July 12th. I just wrote, anyway, I'm working on, I am thinking about Chicago 24/7. It is like my obsession is this convention and making sure it's a success. If you don't want to do it for yourself, do it for me. Come to Chicago. That'll mean the world to me. It'll put a smile on my face if you come to the Chicago convention. But in all seriousness, you should do it for yourself. This is going to be the biggest thing we've ever done. We have never done anything on the scale of what we're about to do in Chicago. I'm so excited, but it's a lot. And to make it a success is not easy. It's a lot. It's a lot. It's a lot. All right. Juanita Limani says, should the global South seek proletariat dictatorships, or should it seek to change politics through give the other cheek approach? Well, what does that mean, right? So proletarian dictatorship, right? That's a term that Marx used, right? And basically the argument is that we live under the rule of the bourgeoisie now, right? That dictatorship just kind of means rule, right? If you dictate, right? If someone's dictating, they're telling you what to write. It's like we live under the rule of the capitalist. And so dictatorship of the proletariat is the rule of the wage worker. And if you read the Communist Manifesto, what Marx says is that the first step in the revolution is winning the battle for democracy and raising the proletariat to the level of the ruling class, right? And that's what he says. That's what, so basically just means that the majority of the people are wage workers and they become the rulers. So it's not like we set up some kind of authoritarian regime and put people up against the wall. I mean, the idea is that the majority wins the battle for democracy and assumes control. Right? That's what he was writing about. But then Gaddafi, if you read the Green Book, he actually opposes the concept of the dictatorship of the proletariat because he says in Libya, we're majority Bedouin, right? We don't have factory workers, right? And then in Russia, right, the Bolsheviks, when they were coming to power, they said, we're not going to have a dictatorship of the proletariat. We're going to have a revolutionary dictatorship of the workers and peasants. Because there was the peasant majority. 90% of the people are peasants. They're not factory workers, proletarians. And Trotsky opposed that because he said the peasants were an inherently backward class. When Mao came to power in China, he said it was on the basis of a block of 4 classes. It wasn't a dictatorship of the proletariat. It was a block of 4 classes. The workers, the peasants, the urban capitalists and merchants, and the national bourgeoisie, the national capitalists, a block of 4 great classes. And those 4 great classes would be led by the Communist Party that had proletarian ideology. And that, look, I mean, again, it's all in here. It's all in What is Innovationism. Dictatorship of the proletariat. If you read even what Engels wrote, he said the proletariat takes power on behalf of all society. And it's not the factory worker becomes the government. Right? That might be literally what Marx meant when he wrote it in 1848, but that has not happened anywhere in the world. and that Lenin understands that the people, you said the global south, these countries that are colonized and oppressed, in order to develop, in order to have industries, they need to break out of imperialist domination, and that the factory worker, the wage worker, has the most to gain in that process. So empowering the factory worker is going to be an essential part of that happening, but the factory worker does it in alliance with capitalists, with peasants, with merchants, with, and that it's really the nation fighting for its national liberation that has the revolution, right? And that maybe if that nation is led by a communist party with their Marxist Leninist ideology, you could argue, well, that's the dictatorship of the proletariat, and that's what they said, right? And that's what Cuba says. They said, okay, well, we're fighting for Cuba, for the whole nation, but we're led by a communist party, and there's a lot of workers involved, so it's the dictatorship of the proletariat, but we're fighting for the whole nation. China, they said, well, it's a block of 4 great classes, but we're led by the Communist Party that has a proletarian ideology. But if you really look at it, this is where I'm not a Marxist, right? That's a foundation of what's happening, but the world has changed. The world has changed, and that if you really look at it, nations are oppressed by globalism, imperialism. And in order to break out of globalism, imperialism, you need to rationally organize the economy. The banks, factories, and industries need to be operating to serve public good and not the profits of a wealthy few. And you need a government that serves the people, not the international corporations. Are the majority of people wage workers? Sure. So is that dictatorship of the proletariat? Kind of, but not purely. Not purely. And it's not really about that. It's about being anti-imperialist and being pro-growth and pro-humanity. And we're in the age where it's not a class struggle so much anymore. It is an opposition to the irrationality of the capitalist and the profit system. It is about being pro-humanity and pro-growth and wanting to unleash productive forces and rejecting the domination of a system that holds back growth and impoverishes people. We're in a new stage. That's why we're innovationists, right? I hope this was helpful. Yeah, I'm glad that was helpful. I hope that was clear. But that's why we're not communists. We're innovationists. We're in a new time, right? And I mean, I don't feel like. Well, anyway, get it. This is free on our website. You just go to cpiusa.org. You can read the whole book for free. And that we're in a new stage. The main thing is that communism is a very negative movement. It's very much about vengeance, rage, unleashing, etc., unleashing one's impulses. And that our new movement that we're building is largely about breaking down atomization and bringing people together. And you can't bring people together if you're encouraging them to be angry all the time and encouraging them to unleash their impulses. Bringing people together means forgiveness. Bringing people together means reconciliation. Bringing people together means empathy, right? And that the Oedipal rebellion, I mean, the red flag comes from the French Revolution. It was originally a red cap that the French peasantry wore as part of their revolution. And red is the color of anger and rage, and it's also the color of sex. And the French Revolution was telling the peasantry they could unleash their rage and unleash their sex. Well, and communism was a continuation of the aesthetic of the French Revolution. It was like the French Revolution didn't create an egalitarian society. Well, we're gonna create an egalitarian society ourselves, and we're just going to amplify. We're going to continue the red, the aesthetics of rebellion, the aesthetics of rage and sex. That's not what we need in our time. Right? You're not going to defeat imperialism with rage and sex. Rage and sex belongs to imperialism, right? Get on the internet. Look at social media. Rage and sex belongs to the imperialists, and look at the anti-imperialist countries of this world. They're doing everything they can to promote families and empathy and loyalty and community. They're not trying to promote rage and sex. So we're in a new stage. We need to promote rationality, and socialism and anti-imperialism are the triumph of reason and innovationism. All right, folks. I hope that you have a great Sabado Sancto. That's tomorrow. I hope you have a great Easter or Resurrection Sunday, whatever you want to call it. If you're an observer of another faith, I hope you have a great Passover. If you're Jewish, I hope you have a great whatever holiday you want. I hope you have a great time. Have a good old time. Have a great 420 if you're a pot smoker. Easter's on 420 this year. So if you're a pot smoker, I don't encourage people to smoke marijuana. I'm just being ironic, right? And I think 420 is also Hitler's birthday. So if you're I'm just kidding. Don't have a bad day. If you're a neo-Nazi, have a bad day. I'm just kidding. But, whatever, right? 420, right? That's April 20th, 420. When I was in high school, someone explained to me that that's pot smoking day. It's Adolf Hitler's birthday, and it's the Columbine Massacre day. And apparently all of that, except for the Hitler birthday part, comes from the fact that I guess 420 was just a code for marijuana at one point. It was because there were supposedly 420 chemicals in marijuana, and that after school people would meet to smoke pot at 4:20 in the afternoon. 4:20 just became code for marijuana, and so then people made 4:20 pot smoking day. And it also happened to be Hitler's birthday. And then I don't know. I don't know. I'm thinking too hard about this. Don't think too hard. 4/22 is Lenin's birthday, which is also Earth Day. The first Earth Day was April 22nd, 1970, which was the 100th anniversary of Lenin's birth. Lenin was born April 22nd, 1870. And to distract from the global celebrations of the centennial 100-year anniversary of Lenin's birth, the U.S. government had a new leftist holiday called Earth Day. And the guy who organized the big Earth Day celebration in Philadelphia was the unicorn killer, which is a whole nother story. You can read about Ira Einhorn, the unicorn killer, the guy who claimed to have invented Earth Day. He didn't technically invent Earth Day, but he tried to claim he did. He was key in some of the early Earth Day celebrations, and he was an intelligence asset. And, he ended up being the unicorn killer. He murdered his girlfriend and then hid in France for years and was protected by the French government. It was a whole nother story you can read about. Oi, 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 oi. Anyway, folks, I really appreciate all of you being here. I'm going to put on the closing music, and thanks, everybody. New upsurge in the struggle against U.S. imperialism is now emerging throughout the world. Ever since World War II, U.S. imperialism and its followers have been continuously launching wars of aggression. But the people of various countries have been continuously waging revolutionary wars to defeat their aggression. And while the danger of a new world war still exists, and the people of all countries must get prepared, revolution is the main trend in the world today.